John, welcome to Edinburgh. We're absolutely delighted that you've so kindly agreed to come up to Scotland to talk to us here at the Asia Scotland Institute. Looking forward very much to what you're going to say. I've read your book with great interest on the politics of humanity, and I'd be very interested to, we will be very interested to hear what you have to say about the key issues that you think that the world is facing, and I'm sure you'll get some very good questions on that.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Roddy, for inviting me, and it's a pleasure to be with the Asia Scotland Institute and here in Edinburgh. I think the single biggest challenge we face is actually in some ways a humanitarian challenge, and that's the turmoil in the Middle East and North Africa, particularly in Syria, where the figures are horrific: 4 million refugees, 6 million people displaced inside Syria, an aid budget of $3 billion just for humanitarian aid, which is only 40% funded, so no wonder the people are leaving. And then the crisis in Iraq and the crisis in Yemen and the crisis in Libya and turmoil elsewhere. This is a huge crisis, and of course the blowback of that now on Europe, which is possibly one of the most serious crises we have faced in Europe, and the European Union in particular, for many years. So I think this is the single biggest issue we face. We're not at the end of it. We're not anywhere near the end of it, I fear, either in terms of solving the problem in Syria or in stopping the flow of refugees into Europe. I fear that flow is going to increase in the coming years before it starts to decrease. And I fear that the example being set by the Syrian refugees is likely to be followed by others living in difficult circumstances in that part of the world, who suddenly see an opportunity to go to Europe, whatever the temporary difficulties of a better, safer, more prosperous life. So that is the single biggest challenge we face. It's a humanitarian crisis. Of course, above all, it's a political and security crisis, which we have to fix if we want to fix the refugee and humanitarian crisis. But the humanitarian consequences of that, both on the spot in the Middle East and now in Europe, are very, very serious.
And when you were working at the United Nations, was this a scenario that you foresaw?
No, I don't think we did, to be honest. I mean, the Syrian civil war hadn't started then. The Arab Spring hadn't started then. When I was at the UN, I left in late 2010. And of course, although people had said for a long time that the conditions in the Middle East and North Africa, in terms of a growing population with few outlets in terms of jobs, regimes which gave no way of people expressing their views, regimes which were treating their people without any dignity or respect and treating them as idiots, you could see the conditions were there for some kind of popular uprising, which of course then happened in Tunisia and spread elsewhere. We didn't predict that at the time. And we didn't predict that there would be a humanitarian crisis of this magnitude. I think in some ways we thought we'd be dealing more with the consequences of climate change than we are, although that's another huge problem.
And that just occurred to me, I mean, because of the demographics and the substantial number of people aged under 20 in the countries that then were swept up in the so-called Arab Spring, I imagine that relatively youthful population was all the more frustrated and calling for change.
Yes, and there were some countries which have not been affected so far by this turmoil, or relatively little affected: Morocco, Algeria, and so on. Where they have huge young populations, a lot of people coming out of universities and colleges with degrees which may or may not be particularly good in terms of degrees, but are looking for jobs corresponding to those qualifications, not finding them, very frustrated. That's a recipe for political and economic trouble, and possibly for flows of people. So we may not have seen anything yet in some ways.
We've talked earlier today about the challenges that the world is facing, some things such as climate change and migration. How well do you feel that the United Nations can function, or the members of the United Nations, in dealing with these crises? Or are we at some sort of watershed where there needs to be a change?
Well, I think at the moment that we have to admit that the United Nations is not functioning well. The Security Council in particular is not functioning well. It's got a very deep division in it between, broadly speaking, the Western countries, who are interventionist and instinct driven to some extent by human rights concerns and the protection of civilians concerns, which frankly are not shared to the same extent by countries like Russia and China and some of the other developing countries which resent being lectured by the West, don't believe in regime change, want to see stability, the ability to deal with your own terrorists as you see fit, all those kinds of issues are there. So the result is that we've become, I think, much worse in the last 15 or 20 years, or even in the last 10 years, at solving some of these big political problems around the world. And we see very much the fruits of that in Syria now, where we seem unable to stop or even control a civil war, which is massively destructive in many, many ways. I honestly think that democracy is the best solution. I mean, Churchill had it right when he said it's the worst of all systems apart from all the others. I'm not sure there are such a things as benign dictatorships. I mean, there are some which are more benign than others, but you can't choose your dictators and you can't fine-tune how they behave. So, genuine democracies are the best solution. Now, what we've discovered rather painfully is that having an election does not make a democracy. Yeah. Having elections is fundamental, to being able to choose your government. But if you don't have institutions which function, if you don't have civil society underpinnings for a democracy, if you don't have a tradition of accepting the results of elections as opposed to contesting them, if you don't have a tradition where it's not winner takes all, in other words, literally winner takes all, then your democracy can turn into something very bad indeed. So, a simple recipe, having an election is not a panacea for countries, but a genuine democracy is the way I think countries are best governed in the end, and dictatorships are not.
I suppose the fact of voting raises expectations.
That's a perfectly fair point. Yeah. We always in these situations, and I think the same in Myanmar in the last few days, people feel if it's the first genuine election they've voted in, or possibly in some cases the first election they've ever voted in, people feel really excited about that, and you can see them displaying their thumb or their forefinger with the indelible ink on it, and it's a moment of real joy and fulfillment. But as you rightly say, this creates huge expectations. The government elected cannot possibly usually fulfill those expectations, and therefore there's a result, the risk of disappointment and disillusion and turning back to some strong man who seems to offer a better solution, which frankly they rarely do. So that's why you need to have the underpinnings of this in terms of institutions which function, a judicial system which functions and which can control the executive, legislatures which function and are not purely rubber stamps, And you don't create those overnight, frankly. It takes a long time. We took hundreds of years in Britain to arrive at the happy point, supposedly, we are now. So how would you expect other countries to do it in a couple of years, particularly after a destructive civil war? The other thing I would say is that, yes, it's very difficult, but we haven't found a better way forward. How are you going to do it otherwise? If you have had a civil war or intervention which has overturned the existing regime, how are you going to give the successor regime legitimacy except through an election? Yeah. If the West comes in and picks some individual, you condemn him by the very fact that you've picked him. So it's a very tricky problem.
One of the things that I'd be interested in is your advice to young people, the next generation, on how to approach the world in which they live, which sometimes strikes me as being particularly dangerous. Do you feel optimistic about the world in which we live and the situation that we see?
I'm probably a realist, but I think you can be optimistic. I mean, the world doesn't look like a very charming place at the moment. It looks rather unpredictable and dangerous and risky because the rules of the game have changed and the new rules of the game are not clear. I mean, in that sense, the Cold War was a more settled period, although a very dangerous period in its own way, than what we face now, particularly from a Western point of view, because we used to think we sort of ran the world, and perhaps we did in some ways, and we certainly don't do that now. So this is a more difficult period. But I think the young generations are fantastically inspired and inspiring, but they need to find ways of making that count. One of the difficult problems, I think, at the moment is the tension between the fact that you now have lots of issues without borders and lots of ways of communications without borders, the internet, social media, where nationality means nothing. And the big problems you're dealing with don't recognise borders, climate change and so on, infectious diseases. And yet national sovereignty is in many ways rearing its head more now than it has done before, certainly in the case of Russia or China. Perhaps even in the case of the UK, perhaps in Scotland in a different sort of way. Yeah. I think it's a particular problem in this country, but I think there's a broader issue, which is that you can see in lots of places, politics is becoming more and more local. People want to feel involved in their local communities, but the problems are more and more global. Now, how do you resolve the tension between those two things? I hope it will be by a more internationalist approach but it's not obvious that's the direction we're going in. So if you're going to be pessimistic, that's what you worry about, this kind of fragmentation and lack of good global governance and lack of a good direction for the world. But on the other hand, you have a huge number of people who are very internationalist in outlook, because that's just the way they're brought up, with a very internet-based approach to life. So that's what can give you the optimism.
And I'd like to thank you very much indeed for making the effort to come up here. I know we're going to have a very interesting session shortly, but we are very, very grateful to you for taking the time to come here. Thank you.
Pleasure.